Well, thank you. I love being invited to groups like this because as I heard in the hallway, someone said, "What's this program about?" And it was, "Oh, it's about death." Well, I'll skip that one. Well, we can't afford to skip this one, right? We got things we need to know. So today what I'm going to do is go through and we're going to start with some basic facts around funerals. I'm not going to get into the funeral industry particularly. That's a whole other bag that we can get into another time. What we're going to be looking at today is how you can exit the planet in a bit greener way, right? And so one of the first things we need to know is how the system works right now, how we got to where we are right now, and what we need to change. So I'm going to start just by talking to you about some facts. You think you know all these things, and then suddenly you realize, maybe I didn't understand it completely. The first thing to understand that as the next of kin to someone who has died, you have total and full custody and control. It doesn't mean that you have to pick up a phone and call someone else to come right away. It means you can decide what happens in that moment. And what we do, we often do call funeral directors. It's a wonderful thing. They're there for you 24/7. But we tend to think that they have some kind of authority that they don't have. And they don't have any medical authority. We're not doing any healing anymore. They don't have legal authority over the body unless you give up your right to custody and control and give it to them, okay? Not a bad thing to do, just telling you that that's the way it works. Involving a funeral director is a choice. It is not mandatory. Embalming also, a lot of people think, oh, but if I don't call a funeral director, the law says I have to embalm. Well, the law does not say that. In fact, embalming is a choice. Again, a choice that we make, and we'll talk more about why we make that choice. But keeping the body cool and clean is sufficient. In fact, in Britain, it's fairly common for people to keep someone home for a couple of weeks before they go off to their final resting place. So this has been done since the beginning of time. We're continuing to do it. A lot of people are surprised when they go to a cemetery or they go to bury someone in a cemetery and they're required to have a cement box that goes around the casket. And you know, there's another couple $1,000s. That is required often by the cemetery, but is not required by the state anywhere. It's a choice that the cemetery trustees that we elect every year make. In which case, if we want to see that change, it's up to us to talk to our elected officials about what we want to see have happen in our cemeteries. But they are not required. We can bury on our home property here in Vermont and New Hampshire. In fact, that has a marked uptick in the last few years. A lot of people are choosing to do this. Big question I get about that is, won't it affect the real estate? Absolutely not. We have studies all around the country that have shown that it doesn't decrease your property values. In fact, some people are kind of excited about it because the way it works is that if you purchase a property and there's a cemetery, family cemetery on it, you now have a bunch of new, very quiet family members. And you can then bury your family there, it becomes your family cemetery, and so on. I get the question here, particularly along the Connecticut River, because people move back and forth, as we all do. And I always tell people that nobody stops you at the border to check your trunk for a dead body. You do have to have a permit to be able to make that drive, but there aren't any funeral police. There's nobody starting a clock. You know, the law gives us the authority to take care of our loved ones and trust that we know what we're doing. Most of us don't, so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. But first, let's do just a little bit of history to understand where we got here. If there are any Civil War buffs in the audience, you'll know that all of this that we are dealing with started with the Civil War. Prior to that, people died at home of farm accidents and tuberculosis, or pleurisy, as they were calling it. Women were pretty much in charge of all the healing, and they were in charge of all the dying. So this was a very powerful area. And people in the church, which was also a central cultural influence, were part of that picture. They didn't use things to fix faces and make things smell better and all that. They simply cooled and cleaned and got the bodies buried as quickly as they could, pretty close by. Cabinet makers were making the caskets and milliners were making the shrouds. It was a pretty simple, streamlined situation. And then we get to the Civil War, and we're having to get those Union soldiers north in pretty heavy heat. And so we have Abraham Lincoln, the first proponent, the first innovator, having to do with encouraging embalming in the U.S. The purpose of this was, again, to get those the soldiers home, but that was almost an afterthought. Colonel Elmer Ellsworth was one of his law clerks, and he was one of the first Union soldiers to die, getting a Confederate flag off a flagpole in his favorite bar. Another big story. But Lincoln had him embalmed and put on display. And this started to raise interest. When his son Willie died at the age of 12 of typhoid, he also had him embalmed, but they didn't bury him. They left him the casket so that he could go and visit and open. By the way, this was the fourth son that they lost, and everyone wonders why Mary had problems with depression. I think if we understand grief in any way, losing 4 sons is a pretty big deal. When Lincoln was assassinated, he was also embalmed, in fact, multiple times on the train, the Lincoln Express, on the way back to Springfield. And everyone, of course, it stopped and everyone saw this. So it became part of the collective that this was the right thing to do, was to embalm bodies so that we could see them. This also led to, prior to his death, of course, Lincoln had required a license in order to do any embalming out on the battlefield. All the surgeons took one look at this whole scenario and went, hey, I can make more money embalming. So they stopped healing and went out and did the embalming. Here's the deal. They all died really early because the early embalming fluids were so full of formaldehyde that it just knocked them all off. But it was the beginning of the funeral industry as we know it now. So part of that was the start of the American, or the National Funeral Directors Association. There are several, but this is the earliest one. But this was for white men only. So women by this point had been determined to be naturally unsuitable for healing. So that's why women didn't become doctors, weren't allowed into medical school, all that kind of stuff. Also were removed from the death sphere. And black funeral directing was its own parallel sort of secret grouping, this secret practice, mainly because of the way that they had to deal with death during slavery. But from that point up until about the 1920s or so, we were talking about how people died in terms of the miasma theory, which said that when you walked into, or on the street or anywhere else, into a sort of dank, smelly thing, that was what was going to kill you. Well, we hit in between here sometime around the 30s, where germ theory that they'd been dabbling in for years was proven, and suddenly everybody completely panicked because this meant that germs were everywhere all the time. So it wasn't just walking into dirty air. That meant that they stopped using paper money because you could wash coins. They stopped going to the library because they didn't want to touch paper because they thought the germs were on the books. The men shaved beards because that was a conduit for germs, and the ladies, right? So this is how we get into the 1930s and the flapper era. Part of that is because we're trying to skimp on anything that might move germs around. But what this did was, this was a big push for the funeral industry, because they could say, look, the dead bodies are dangerous, they're all infectious, and leave it to us, we'll take care of it. So that was a major reason for why the industry took off. And here's what we know now. We have major organizations around the world who have all made very strong statements about the fact that bodies are not automatically infectious. And we know that even through COVID. At first, when we had COVID, everybody was saying, oh no, we can't bury anybody anymore. And the CDC fortunately jumped in very quickly and said, no, this isn't that type of a problem. So embalming today, one of the things that happened was, again, along with the idea that all bodies are infectious, was Another idea that the industry put out, which was that what we needed to do was create a memory picture. That's why you embalm. It's not for health and safety. There's no public health and safety about it. It's a cosmetic procedure that makes Caucasian cheeks nice and pink, so that when you look at someone during a visitation, they look less dead. That's kind of the point. What happened, it only lasts up to about 14 days, because again, we're not using that super formaldehyde. There are other things in there that are not so great. They're not a danger to you and me, but they are a danger to embalmers, as you can see. Higher risks of myeloid leukemia, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, lots and lots of respiratory issues, Parkinson's disease, neurological problems. So it is still sort of weaving its magic. Some of the things we need to know about that is that when we embalm, all the body fluids that are removed go into a septic system or into our wastewater treatment plant. There's no magic place for all that stuff to go. So just good to know a couple of these things before we keep going. It's sort of a little basis. So what I want to tell you about next is what happens if you do decide to, if I can get this to move. There we go. If you decide to do it yourself, we're calling these family-directed funerals or home funerals. As I say, they used to be the norm. Bringing them back seems unusual to people, but we found that more and more people are very interested in this. The idea is that we retain that custody and control, and we do non-invasive body care. But I say to people who are concerned about this, oh, I wouldn't know what to do, and I ask them, do you know how to operate a washcloth? Because it's that simple. We bathe the body and we cool the body. And we can do that with a split. We can do that with dry ice, although that's kind of messy. We use, for the most part, something called Techni Ice. I have some on the back table you can take a look at. It's not activated, but you activate it and it's marvelous. It cools the body down and you reduce the temperature in the room and you can stay that way for any period of time. This is called sheltering. Here in Vermont, you have to wait 24 hours between the death and a cremation. So the body has to be somewhere. In Vermont, in New Hampshire, it's 2 days. So where's that going to be? Slow things down, let it happen at home, and then you move on. During that time, you can file the death certificate. It's not a difficult thing to do. Everybody goes, oh, so many details. It takes you less than an hour at the town clerk's office, and you complete that. I'll show you how to go about that. You can either make your own casket or shroud. You can purchase them from others, and I'll show you where you can look for more of those. You can transport the body. One of the most memorable moments in my life with my family was with my sister as we drove my mom to the crematorium. And we put music on the radio with her in the back. And we just sang our little hearts out all the way there and just laughed because she would have adored this whole idea. So good things can happen in the middle of all of this. The point is that it gives you a chance also to slow down. You're not just like waiting to schedule your grief, you know, on Tuesday at 6. People can come and go through the house and really take the time that they need until they're ready. Obviously, we want to hire professionals if we need them and if we want them. So, and I'm not saying don't hire them, I'm saying decide which pieces and parts you want. So who is that next of kin that I was talking about? Well, Vermont and New Hampshire both work pretty close to the same, but the main concept is that the spouse is almost always the person who gets to make decisions. That would be the next of kin, if that exists. On an equal par with that is something called the designated agent. This is relatively new legislation in many states where you can identify someone that you would like to manage things. It's not your durable power of attorney for health care. Once someone stops breathing, that goes away. That doesn't work anymore. So you have to designate someone specifically for funeral plans. That wouldn't be your durable power for finance either. They just cut checks unless you ask them to do this as well. So it's that next of kin, that spouse, that designated agent. Why would we want one? Well, we might have a kid who's 3,000 miles away and can't get there in time for us to do what we want to do. We might be a partner in an LGBTQ plus relationship, and that person doesn't have the legal authority to speak for us unless we designate them. There's lots of reasons why this has been put in place. It goes down the line. If the first is not willing or able, it goes to the next person, usually an adult son or daughter. If you have more than one, they have to have a majority agreement in Vermont. And then go to a parent and brothers and sisters. It goes right on down the line. So it's pretty straightforward. And what does the paperwork look like? Paperwork is just a one sheet. If you've got a driver's license, you can figure out how to fill this form out. But we help you by putting together a worksheet that you can download off the, we have the vermontfuneral.org website, and you can get all the Vermont information there, or the New Hampshire one. And you can download one of these worksheets, fill it out, have it done ahead of time, put it with your advance directives. And that way, if you hire a funeral director, you can just hand that to them. You don't have to spend an hour trying to figure out what, Uncle Ted's military discharge number was. So you can find all of those things. But it's really very easy. Death certificates are generated by the medical authority, whether that's a hospice nurse or someone in the hospital, or your PCP if you're not on care. They're the ones who start it. They have the form. And then they finish their part, they hand it to the family, the next of kin, they complete their part. It goes to the town clerk, and it gets filed electronically. You get handed a permit to do whatever you want to from that point on, and off you go. It's really very, very easy. So one of the other things we can do, we can call Social Security ourselves, and I recommend that you do that regardless of who does the work here, within 30 days. I don't know if anybody remembers, but years ago there was a great article on 60 Minutes about people whose Social Security number had been incorrectly reported, and they ceased to exist. And people who actually had those numbers ceased to exist, the ones that got usurped. So you want to be sure that the number is right. You can call Veterans Affairs. They're absolutely marvelous to work with. You don't have to wait for someone to do that for you. If you want to send in an obituary, you can do that too. Sometimes the newspapers will like to have a copy of the death certificate, not the certified copy, but just to know for sure it's not a hoax. This was a thing years ago. But it's really not that difficult to do. If all of that still sounds a little too overwhelming, but you're looking for a little more help, there are lots of people who have been coming to the fore lately and specializing in being helpers all along the death care continuum. It starts with end-of-life planners, people who you can call and just sit down, do your advance directives with, and set up things like designated agent forms and so on. These are pretty easy to find. We also have end-of-life doulas. You may have heard the term death doula. We don't use that. That's a media term, so that you can shock people. We're end-of-life doulas, and what we do is assist the family or the dying person in non-medical ways at the end of life, just helping people think things through, being that extra helper beyond a hospice volunteer. At that point, at the point of death, that stops, right? They can no longer charge any money or do that kind of thing. So we move to home funeral guides, and they are versed in what needs to happen, and they can walk you through all the things I'm going to be talking to you about today. We also have celebrants, people who are non-denominational or interfaith, who can help with rituals and ceremonies and help do all that. So lots more people coming to the fore around us. So that's the funeral part. A lot of people confuse this. Often I'll ask people, say, hey, have you planned your funeral? And they say, yeah, I'm gonna have a cremation. And I go, that's not the funeral. That was the funeral part. This is the disposition part, okay? So let's talk about lawn cemeteries, and another little interesting story to get you started. Why do we even have these vaults, these cement boxes? Mainly because of this guy. His name is Wilbert Haas. The Wilbert Company makes most of the vaults in this country. But he was from a family of asphalt and concrete magnates. And he went to Egypt in 1930 to see King Tutankhamun's tomb. And he had this brilliant idea. He came back, got a patent, and started selling these concrete vaults that he promised were going to keep Grandma from turning into a zombie, okay? and keep all the animals from coming all the way down in there and doing things. All of it is baloney. They crack, they leak. There's no protective quality to them. We don't need to be protected from Grandma, and we don't really need to worry that she's going to be among the living, walking dead. It also meant, though, that we were going to protect all of us from these guys, and they called them ghouls, all right? But they're grave robbers, body snatchers. By this point, by 1930, we already had anatomical donation laws and all kinds of stuff to prohibit this, but he was still capping in on the fear that people had around all of this. The reality is, the reason we have vaults, it keeps the lawns flat so we can mow them. That's the point. And this is what it looks like right now. That's what it looks like underground. You can see sort of concrete paving, just parking lots. We put all this stuff in the ground every year, and we put herbicides and pesticides on the grass every year. We have a lot of things that about this that don't make a lot of sense to some of us. We're running out of space, and you know our municipalities have to pay for these cemetery space, and when we fill them up with all this concrete, we have to go buy more land. Taxpayers pay for that. So there's an ongoing effect around all of this work. Another thing to know about that, if you're still worried and you think concrete boxes are going to keep bad things from happening to soil and water, we've discovered categorically that the reason that any pollution might happen, what we call cemetery plume, sort of leakage out from standing water or groundwater, comes from what we're putting in the ground with the body, not the body. The body is full of nutrients. And when it's left alone, it doesn't go anywhere. This is the kind of stuff that's in caskets, and you can see what the opportunity would be for leaching out into whatever might be nearby. So that's more of a concern. And a lot of these things, you look at the fabrics that are in standard caskets, none of these are biodegradable in any way. And if you're still worried about water, this is how many states in the US have any kind of prohibitions or setbacks having to do with cemeteries. Vermont and New Hampshire, in fact, Vermont was the first state to have any kind of slow down, we need to be sure about where we put the cemeteries. Vermont's always a leader in this kind of thing. But you can see not very many states really care where we locate cemeteries. They're not worried about the water. And as far as burial depth is concerned, only 2 go deeper than 4 feet. So the idea of 6 feet under is a big old misnomer. What else is happening in our lawn cemeteries? Our cemetery workers are at risk. They're the ones who are exposed to all the herbicides and pesticides, not just those of us who used to run in them with resulting asthma, but cleaning agents and so on. And you probably have seen the class action suit advertised on TV for Roundup. These are the guys they're really talking about. They're the ones who are exposed to it on a daily basis. Lots of neurological disorders and cancers and respiratory issues. You'll notice, though, that we don't have any figures for this. We study the professionals. We tend not to study the non-professionals. But I can guess that these numbers are probably commensurate. So that's why we're looking at changing cemeteries. And a lot of people will go, okay, then we won't bury anymore. We'll go just to cremation. Well, here in Vermont, I think we're at about 75, 78% cremation now. We're starting to pull back the veil on this so that people can understand what goes into cremation and why that may not be the greenest thing that you can do. But let's take a look at some of the reasons, the different ways that we can look at this and see if any of them work for you. I want to point out the difference here. On the left, we have cremated remains from an alkaline hydrolysis process that we'll talk about in a sec. On the right is flame cremation, significantly different end product, okay? The one on the right is from flame cremation, the kind we're used to. Yeah, that would be this one right here. This burns fossil fuels for a significant period of time. It also puts mercury and other elements up into the waterways that come up into the air, comes down into the waterways. And what it does is leave about 7 to 10 pounds of that pulverized bone And we think of it as ashes, but it's not, it's bone. And that consists of calcium, phosphate, and sodium. If you're a gardener, you know you're not going to put salt on your grandmother's rose bush and expect it to survive, or put it under it. The other thing is that this is incinerated. So it has destroyed any nutrient value that was left in the bone. So what we've got is this sort of dense, heavy, just non-nutrient rich material that has to be disposed of. And what these gentlemen are doing here is spreading it all over an alpine area with fragile flowers and shrubs and so on. And what we find when there's enough of that, it mimics what happens when farms have phosphorus, lots of fertilizer that runs off into streams. Phosphorus runoff is what causes algae bloom that kills off marine life and marine plants. So we are paying close attention to people scattering, how much they scatter. So that's a big part of it. A lot of it is a carbon footprint that we're putting up into the air. And the people who are running those units, those cremation retorts, we have started studying them and discovered that we have a higher increase exposure for cancers. This radiopharmaceutical contamination, usually having to do with breast cancer treatment or prostate cancer treatment. Those seeds that get activated, you put them in one of these and they go wild. So there's a lot of dangers around this. It still might be the most reasonable thing for you to do. What we have to be paying attention to is what we do with those remains. And what we need to know is that it's legal and free to put them anywhere, as long as you have permission. You probably won't get permission to put them in the bunker at your local, golf club. A lot of people do that. They think it's good. Those poor guys are out there raking those things out all the time. National parks and state parks, for many, many years, just sort of turned a blind eye to people who wanted to scatter there, thought it didn't make a big difference. Well, now they're having to restrict it because more and more people, as the more people are doing this, they're trying to find places of meaning to put these cremated remains, and they're dumping them in places and just killing off whatever is there. So they're restricting it. They're also being more careful about any lands that were Native American lands, and Native American communities are standing up and saying, stop putting this stuff on our sacred land. The best place, honestly, in a natural cemetery, a conventional cemetery. It's protected. Cemeteries are protected. They're going to pretty much stay right where they are. There are exceptions, but that's the main deal. Faith communities, churches often have memorial gardens, so they'll dedicate a certain space to burying cremated remains, and that's meaningful to people. It isolates it, keeps it in one place, so you're doing the least amount of damage. So 2 more cremation processes. You may not have thought of these as cremation, but they are. They are legally, the language that makes these legal is in the cremation statutes in all the states where it is legal. And there are about 29 states now that have legalized it. I believe that Vermont is one of them. New Hampshire was legal a few years ago, and then they made it illegal again. The purpose of this is to use less energy. It does use less energy, about 80% less than flame cremation. It also neutralizes cytotoxins and so on. It gives you that cleaner, lots more of it, that bone that still needs to be removed and crushed and disposed of. Unfortunately, we also have to dispose of about 300 gallons of effluent from the water that was used with the lye in it. That had to be heated and forced through and so on. So lots of energy consumption here. The mercury is captured, which is better than it is with flame cremation. So those things there are some real pluses to this. It's the disposal that's the problem. I mean, we don't have a legal way of disposing it other than in our wastewater treatment plants. And they do a really good job of it, by the way. It's just that it's another thing that we as taxpayers are paying for, is that extra burden on our infrastructure. So a lot of communities are concerned about this. The Catholic Church is very concerned about this. They call this flushing grandma down the drain. So, they're the ones who are pushing back in a lot of places. I think it's inevitable that it will eventually become a thing, but right now the closest place to us is Belfast, Maine.
Where?
Belfast, Maine. So natural organic reduction is the human composting. And I know you've heard a lot about this in the news because the media really gets this one wrong despite a life work of attempts on my part to get them to get it right. This is another cremation process, legally. It also is cremation process because what has to happen is that once all of this process takes place, the bones are still left. And also, unlike the other processes, what we call the durables, which is hair and teeth and nails. So when we get done with this process, which takes a couple of months, of it's temperature and humidity controlled in an industrial venue, right? For the most part, they're not all industrial, but this one is for sure. The body lays in this tub full of alfalfa that, by the way, is mostly grown in the western states. It is responsible for draining close to half of the water from the Colorado River Basin to be used for livestock, but they're using it in this process too. Wood chips, when you look at the sample that I have in the back of the room on the table, you're going to notice it's not soil, it's mulch, it's wood chips. That's what's really left. But the body goes in with that, it goes then through this. This isn't a whole bunch of beehive capsules, it's just the one. And they have a laying in ceremony, it's the funeral part. And then the body goes back and gets put into another container that's controlled. That happens for a couple of months, and what happens at the end of that is the bones and all those other things are removed. The bones are pulverized, and then they're added back into the mix. So we've got another cremated body that goes back in, essentially. It also means that we're going to take whatever size a person was, and we're going to turn them into about 3/4 of a ton of this mulch. Well, we have to find a place to put this mulch. Originally, we were thinking this would be fabulous in urban areas because people can't get out to cemeteries easily from the city, so we would do it in, and so most of these facilities are going to be right in urban areas. The idea was to take all that material then and donate it to Public Works. Well, Public Works is getting an eyeball on it and going, yeah, we can't use that. Conservation cemeteries take a look at that and go, why in the world would I want a cubic yard of material when all we have to do is have someone drive to the cemetery and we bury them in the ground, and nature does exactly this in the ground. So we're having trouble finding places for all of this stuff to go. Conserved lands don't want it. It's not part of their conservation plan. So kind of a concern as well. Another quick thing I just want to mention is greenwashing. And I want to be sure you know, these other processes that I've just described, those are real things. They really are working. They really are solutions for a lot of people. And I think they will be refined over time, and they'll get better. They'll reduce their carbon footprint and be more accessible. And I hope the price will come down so that they're also affordable. But in the meantime, there are a whole lot of people out there trying to make big money on this wave of interest. So I want you to keep an eye out for a few things. Greenwashing is basically misrepresenting products and processes by calling them green when they have a hidden footprint. This casket is made of wicker. It's absolutely 100% biodegradable, absolutely beautiful. It comes from Indonesia. And we don't know if little children made this, so we're using child labor, what kind of wages they were paid, what kind of circumstances they were in. It also then had to be transported halfway around the world, so it's got a very heavy carbon footprint. So don't look at something and just go, oh, look, that's green. Think about the rest of what might go into it. I want to mention a couple other things that kind of go with this. Capsula mundi, you may have seen this picture before, and it looks as though you can have your body put into this eggshell and buried and have a tree over you. Everybody wants to be a tree. Doesn't work that way. Nature doesn't work that way. These are not. They advertise these as being made out of biodegradable plastic, whatever that might be. And these are actually urns for cremation. They are not for burial. They advertise them and make them look as though they are, and people get excited, but they're not. So not a thing. The one in the middle, Memorial Forests, you're probably hearing a lot about Memorial Forests. They've got a lot of money behind them from Silicon Valley venture capitalists who are funding the idea of purchasing big swaths of land, starting conservation land trust entities that don't have boards and they're not your nature conservancy. If you look at them, they register with the state and then they walk away. So watch out for that. They'll charge anywhere between $4,000 and $24,000 to own a tree where you can put cremated remains only. They are not registered as cemeteries. So when they're done, if you look at their deeds, you can see when they're done and they've got enough money out of people, they can build a high rise there, no problem. So you want to really read the fine print when you start hearing the pitches. And they've co-opted the language of conservation to the point where it's really hard to tell what you're dealing with. So keep an eye out. This is another one, the mushroom suit. You probably heard a lot about the mushroom suit. Everybody got very excited about this too. The idea was originally to infuse a suit with shiitake mushrooms, and they realized that's not going to work so well. So started using mycelium. Mycelium is that stuff in leaf litter. When you're walking in the woods and you kick it over, it's in the first 4 to 6 inches. It's that white cotton candy-like looking thing, right? And it's marvelous. It does great work in nature, but it doesn't work 4 feet under. And they did a study on it finally that was separate from the company, an independent study in Texas, and they got halfway through the time period and just picked up and abandoned it, left, because there was zero activity and the company is no longer in business. So these things catch our imagination, and that's wonderful because they get us thinking. But we need to be like keeping our heads on and doing the homework so that we understand how they work, which is why this is the last part for you. I saved the good stuff for last. This is the sexy stuff, as far as I'm concerned. It's very hard to get people to think of it that way, though, because it's not all shiny and new and interesting. This is age-old, proven way of having our bodies turn to earth, actual soil. If we weren't cremating here, this is what we would be sequestering in any given year rather than expending it, right? This is the cost of cremating bodies in the US for 1 year. Imagine what would happen if we buried instead. So what we're looking at with natural burial, and I call it natural burial, you can call it green burial, whatever you want to call it. The idea is that we're putting the body in the ground at 3.5 to 4 feet. Again, the law allows for that. That's a perfectly fine place to be. We get rid of that vault. We don't need that. We use biodegradable containers, and we'll talk more about where to find those. And we just use that non-invasive preservative if we're going to use any at all. The idea here is that we're trying to make it as accessible and affordable to people as we can too. And people are always saying, oh, how much will it cost? And you'll hear people always saying, oh, it's going to cost so much more. Well, no, it costs the price of a grave plot, just like it would if you were putting other things in it. We're just not putting the things in it. So we're just looking at burial without impediment. Why should the price change? So if your local cemetery is burying at $400 a plot, that's the price. So there are different types of cemeteries. According to the Green Burial Council, what we came up with was the idea that there might be local towns with their municipal cemeteries or church cemeteries that have been burying with vaults, but they could make a decision to stop requiring vaults altogether or setting aside a separate spot where we can bury without them. So it just takes the cemetery trustees in your town to figure out how you can do this. But that's what a hybrid is. We don't ask for anything fancy, just get rid of the vault. In a natural cemetery, we're looking at land that's specifically designed for a cemetery that buries everyone without impediment. And then conservation level cemetery is a natural cemetery that also partners with a bona fide land trust. We have one in Nashville that is partnered with the Nature Conservancy. Many, all the way from local conservation commissions to TNC or others. As long as we've got conservation easement in place on the land and we're following conservation best practices. And I'll talk a little bit more about that because that really is sort of the big idea because that's what's going to help us save land and find more sustainable ways to bury. I do want to mention, let's go back to that home burial for just a minute. One of the things that people think is, oh, well, I've got 10 acres, I'll just ask all my friends to come on down. But it's for family members only. It also means that we're going to provide that public right-of-way, and I call this lipstick on a napkin. All that's really required is that you, on a piece of paper, mark where someone can park, where they can walk to get to this burial space in the future. If you don't do it, the selectmen have the authority to do that. And that's going to be added to the deed, the property deed upon transfer. Doesn't have to happen until transfer, but most people like to get it on there. This is a real estate full disclosure. That's what it's all about, to make sure that people know where the bodies are buried. You do have to comply with state setbacks. Vermont changed theirs a few years ago, so it's a little more complicated, but the general rule of thumb is around 500 feet from known water sources. You can look at more details if you want to. You want to check local zoning ordinances, although what we found in New England is, for the most part, when we started doing zoning a few years ago, we weren't thinking about people burying at home. So there tends not to be anything there. So you can't prove a negative. Go in, take a look at the zoning. If it's not there, you're good to go. We do ask people to, and this isn't required by law, but we do ask people to let the municipal cemetery trustees know that this has occurred, so that, you know, it's in your deed, but that isn't the same as the inventory that your trustees want to keep of where all the historical cemeteries are and so on. It may not be part of their formal inventory, but it's good for them to know. What did I miss?
Maybe, you may be burying yourself in one spot, but if you have an idea of you would like your children and grandchildren to be buried there also, you need to make sure that you've got an easement there already outlined that allows
Yes.
the offspring to be buried there also. And I see that you have provided a public right-of-way. Well, what you need
That's
is
part of the easement, yeah.
is an easement
Yep.
on the property that reaches to the public right-of-way.
Right. Good. I'm going to amend this for Vermont because you're right. Vermont uses a different terminology than New Hampshire does.
Yeah.
You're right. It means the same thing. It's just what you're talking about. Perfect. That was excellent. Thank you. Back to conservation burial quickly, just because it's really important to understand this. When you hear a lot of the talk about these other processes, one of the things that they're going to try to convince you is that they're saving land by doing a cremation process. Well, if we have some conservationists in the room, this should resonate with you. You don't save land by just letting it go away to someone else. You save land by saving it, by actually buying it and stewarding it and caring for it. That's how we save land. So this is part of the idea here, is that we're using burial as one strategy for tying people to the land, for bringing people in and saying, you have a burial of a loved one on this property. You're going to want to come back again. You're going to want to engage in activities that happen on that land. You're going to want to help the land trust achieve its goals in caring for that land. So that's a big part of what we're doing. We're trying to connect people to that land in really important ways. And we're looking at sustainability models so that we can keep using this land forever. Things that people are afraid of around green burial. First one is, but won't the grave cave in? I hear this from cemeterians a lot. And what I have to remind them of is that we're not putting massive amounts of things in the grave. So if we're just putting a shrouded body in the grave, there's nothing to cave, right? When we're putting all the soil back, We put it all back, we mound it up, we let it settle. It all works just fine. Nobody's in danger. We're also not going very deep. We're not going the full amount that you'd have to go to put in the vault. So that means that there's plenty of space. Animal disturbances. Everybody asks about this. It's like the number one thing I have to always deal with when I'm on radio programs. That's the one that everybody calls in. We haven't got any evidence of any animals disturbing other than skunks. They like to come and get the grubs after we've tilled the soil, but they're not interested in this. We don't smell good to them. They can't smell us that far down. They just can't smell that far if we're talking coyotes and all that kind of stuff. There are no odors. It's just not an issue. Cool and clean, and we're far enough down there are not going to be odors either. What about pharmaceuticals, people who've had chemo and so on? Well, the beauty of this is that we're not mowing lawns on top here. We're putting back native plants that have root systems that go into the ground and bind anything that isn't good, and they're going to use the nutrients that are good. So if you want to be a tree, you want to be prairie grass, you want to be whatever, this is the way to do it. We don't worry about those pharmaceuticals. We don't worry about pathogens either. In fact, the only time we don't touch the grave, we don't, we make sure there's nothing happening, is if someone died of Ebola, which we don't have here, or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, the brain prion disease. Those are things that last longer than just a couple of days. There's a hepatitis variety that lasts about 7 days. Not a big deal. We're in the ground. We're not disturbing anybody. Again, those things are going to be bound. They're not going to be traveling anywhere. Metals, get a lot of questions about metals. And this is where we have to go, okay, well, a little bit of baby steps here, because I am not cutting the zippers out of anybody's pants, and I'm not going to remove your knee or any of that kind of stuff. We do not remove people's fillings out of their teeth or any of that gory kind of thing. It's just fine. The things that are in our bodies are not things that are going to leach like the stuff that we're putting in that I showed you. So we're going to leave it alone. We're not going to worry about it. And can we bury in the winter? We absolutely can bury in the winter. There are 3 states in the Midwest that require that cemeteries stay open all winter long. And this is one of them in Milwaukee. You can see what they do. They go old school. They just put a fire and they move the coals back and forth until the frost is out. They dig up, bury, and they're good to go. We do have equipment that we can manage that better. But what I'm finding here in New England is that there are a lot more cemeteries that are open in the winter now than used to be. Our snowpack is less. That was the big concern. The big concern was bringing in heavy equipment. Well, you don't need the heavy equipment if you're not bringing in the 2,000-pound vault. So we can get to these spaces more easily. So just want to run you through quickly what it might look like to attend a funeral ceremony and disposition in a green burial cemetery. And these are different types, so they aren't going to look the same. They're from all over the country, but they give you a general feel. The first thing is that we don't drive up into a lot of these properties. In hybrid cemeteries, your regular municipal cemetery, yeah, you can still drive in for the most part, get close, but a lot of them we don't drive in. So we start at the parking lot, and we're carrying. We're going back to old-fashioned processions. Often we'll stop on the way because the funeral is actually starting there. We might stop, do some music, a reading, a poem, something like that. There's nothing to stop that. It becomes a communal event right away. If you're mobility challenged and you need to get out to the grave, we're finding ways to get more people where they need to go using electric vehicles. Not a lot of burros, but we are using different ways to get people and the casket or the shroud up to where they need to be. Once we get there, the grave will already be dug. Often we have them dug by volunteers. There's a group in Gainesville, Florida at Prairie Creek Cemetery called the Society of the Pick and Spade. And it's people who get a call when they need a burial, and they go and they join the family members and they help them to dig that grave. It's very cathartic, gets people very connected to what's happening. After it's dug, what we're going to do is put in what we call biomass. We're going to put organic materials, and we'll make them as pretty as we can, because why not? Art in the cemetery is starting to be a big deal, big thing. But we're putting this in here because it helps with the process. It also produces an oxygen trap that's helpful. It's also nicer to lower someone onto this. As you can see, we have boards on the side so we don't have any cave-in. And we have the rails in some of these where the people who are doing the lowering are just going we're going to set the casket or the shrouding board on top of those, lift up, and someone pulls the rails, and then the lowering occurs. Ceremony. There's nothing to prevent any kind of ceremony that you want. There's nothing different about being there. Lots of veterans are choosing to be buried in green cemeteries rather than in the Veterans Cemetery. And they have a lot of really interesting reasons around that, but we are noting that. So all the honors can occur there too. Back to the lowering for just a sec. There's different ways to do this, but as you can see, we have different ways to get the body into the ground. It's just good to kind of see the way. You don't have to change your whole family tradition around this. So once the lowering's occurred, we're going to put more of this biomass over the top. We call this blanketing. And that again gives that air exchange, but it also gives us a softer place for the soil to land. And that's more comforting. We use shovels of all different sizes because kids get into this like it's their business. They feel connected to what's going on, and they want to get in there and finish that job. And a lot of people who started out thinking they weren't going to, this was just too weird for them, they're the ones you're going to find later who are standing there with, shirts stripped off, and they're going to finish the whole thing. We call it crying and digging. And it surprises people how important it is to them to do that. We finish off then, we've mounded, we put all that soil back, and then we're just going to cover it with some more organic material, again, as pretty as we can. We want to be sure that, that it stays in place. If we have a weather event, it doesn't get eroded. And it's a nice look back. A lot of times people will say, oh, I've heard about green burial, no headstones, you just have to walk away. I don't like that idea. Well, it couldn't be further from the truth. We are very interested in the memorial part of this. In fact, as I mentioned, the art exhibits, we'll often have art installations, both temporary and permanent, on the cemetery grounds that are associated with the burials. Not just a bench, but it might be more than that, something different. We are keeping track with GIS where we can. It's not necessary, but it's really helpful because, as we know as New Englanders, any of you who've had anything to do with trying to find records in some of our old town halls that got flooded out, this is a real godsend. It means that we will always know, we'll always have a record. You can use any kind of a rock. Usually we're using something that we found on the property, so it's native. But here's what's really interesting. We're finding more ways to use technology. When you looked at anybody who's younger than most of us in this room, they've lived on their phones since they were born. They don't need a memory picture of the last time they saw somebody. They can just go to the grave, scan that QR code, and up can pop videos, music, anything that they want that associates them with that person. That's memorialization. We're changing the definition. It's not just a stone anymore. I mentioned that we do a lot of things in these cemeteries. We bring people in. We're trying to create community. We're also having people who come to these events because they're looking for that community, and they're also looking to help support what's happening at the cemetery. Goat yoga has been going on at Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. for many, many years. They have a dog day every month. People come to the cemetery to do that. Pulling people into what we consider to be dead spaces and making them for the living is really at the root of a lot of the work around green burial right now. And as you can see, it's kind of endless what you can do there. Just want to mention quickly, we do use shrouds. I've been talking about them, and I mentioned a shrouding board. If you look in the middle here, that's a shrouding board. We might bury that, but we might also just sort of do a quick tip and move it out so that we can reuse it. We're using more than just pine boxes too. You can see found materials, lots of wicker, that type of thing that's made here. These are local artists in their area. What I did was pull a whole bunch of them together and created this website where you can go and look to see who in your area makes them, so we can be supporting our local artists and craftspeople. Two last quick things. One is, and I've alluded to this before, part of our mission in Green Burial is to provide social justice and also environmental justice. And this is becoming kind of a big thing, particularly in urban areas. We don't think about it so much here, right? We have access to the outdoors. We can go out to the woods and get a walk pretty quickly. But there are people who don't have that kind of access, feel unsafe, and don't have the funds for this type of thing. So we're looking at reconfiguring the way that we do burials in general here in the US so that we're making them more affordable and accessible to everyone. And who's really interested? Well, this has jumped like you wouldn't believe. When I first started doing this work in about 2007, the interest was next to nothing. I saw a couple articles a year about green burial. Kept wondering why no one else had clued into this yet. Well, now, as of May of 2021, if you ask a sample group, about 91% are interested in doing things in a better way, a more environmentally friendly way. And if you ask them if in the next 2 weeks you had to make a decision about one of these, more than 84% said, yeah, green burial's the way to go. So we know that we have momentum and we have people interested. If you want to find cemeteries that bury green right now in Vermont and New Hampshire, you go to nhfuneral.org to Green Burial, and you'll find a list there of all the cemeteries in the US and Canada that are burying green that I know about. I keep this list for all the organizations that I've been helping run for years, the Green Burial Council, Conservation Burial Alliance, and so on. So, and it changes frequently. I hear from people like you who say, hey, yeah, I know this one over here. So we try to keep up to date. And the more of these cemeteries that are online that are burying green at whatever level, that gives you more to take with you when you go speak to your trustees and say, look, everybody's doing it. Maybe they'll think about it too. So that's, one more thing, I wanted to circle back to this just really quickly. Some other things are really changing too, and you may notice this. Women are in charge these days of the home funeral movement. We've been working pretty hard on this for the last 20 years and it bringing this tradition back. Half of these conservation burial grounds in the US are run by women. It's 50-50. And 72% of last year's funeral director schools, mortuary schools, are women. Men are leaving the profession and women are coming back in. So it's an interesting trend to just keep an eye on. So that's what I have for you today, and I think we're doing okay for time. I hope that was not too much. An hour is about my saturation point. I don't know about you. Anybody?